Good morning. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies, a think tank in Washington that examines and critiques the impact of immigration in the United States. We are doing this panel today on the weaponization of immigration, essentially the use of migration as a tool in geopolitics, not so much the geopolitical consequences of immigration, but the direct use of immigration as a weapon, or maybe more broadly as a tool, as an instrument of geopolitics. And this is particularly important today for a number of reasons. For instance, President Trump's proclamation invoking the Alien Enemies Act describes the use of migration to the U.S. by the Venezuelan regime and its sort of minions as, among other things, serving the Maduro regime's goal of destabilizing democratic nations in the Americas, including the United States. This is a textbook example of weaponization of immigration. Last year, there was some talk, including the Inter-American Dialogue had a publication warning of the Nicaraguan government's strategy of using illegal immigration as a weapon against the United States. And of course, the classic case, which we'll hear more about, at least in this hemisphere, is Fidel Castro's unleashing of 120,000 Cubans almost overnight in Florida in the 1980 Mariel boatlift. Europe, of course, also has seen migration used against it as a weapon, either, for instance, by Turkey as a kind of means of extorting cash and other concessions, or by Russia and Belarus as retaliation against sanctions or other policies undertaken by the EU that they opposed. Although this weaponization of migration is a worldwide problem, it's not one that all countries face, because it is a form of asymmetric conflict, but the asymmetry is not in kind of means of weaponry or power as one usually thinks of asymmetric warfare, like terrorists use it against countries with large armies. Instead, it's based on a moral asymmetry. Things that civilized countries are norms that they establish for themselves, where their opponents do not abide by. As Kelly Greenhill wrote in her 2010 book, Weapons of Mass Migration, liberal democracies are the main targets of weaponized migration because, quote, democracies are more likely than their illiberal counterparts to have codified juridical human rights and migration-related commitments. In other words, things like the UN Refugee Convention and Protocol, the European Convention on Human Rights, the Convention Against Torture, and similar measures, many of which are signed, ostensibly agreed to, by both democratic and authoritarian regimes, but are basically ignored by the latter and used against democratic countries. What's more, judges, NGOs, and others within democracies serve as de facto allies of authoritarian regimes using migration as a weapon. To a degree, this is unavoidable because there really are some things that civilized countries aren't going to do. We are not going to be setting up machine guns on southern border wall and just opening fire on anybody who approaches. But there are steps that can be taken. For instance, and maybe even the most important, would be changing our anachronistic, out-of-date Cold War policy of asylum, which really represents one of the main weapons used against democratic countries. I've written on asylum specifically in the journal Lehman, making this case, and the Heritage Foundation actually just last week released a report about reforms to asylum that would weaken its effectiveness as a weapon against the United States specifically, but other countries as well. Before introducing the panelists, I want to point out that today's event is part of an international collaborative effort starting in 2023, which we have called the International Network for Immigration Research, or INIR, which is online at inirnet, INIRNET.org. INEAR brings together 5 research organizations in the U.S., France, Hungary, and Israel, as well as some individual scholars, which independently work to make the case for the sovereign right of their countries to make immigration policies based on their specific national interests rather than on abstract human rights concerns. So to discuss these issues, we have 3 speakers on today's panel. First is Philip Linderman, a 30-year veteran of the Foreign Service, the U.S. Foreign Service, whose duties often focused on things like U.S. border security, international travel, migration policies, and what have you. He's one of the founders of something called the Ben Franklin Fellowship, which he can discuss a little more if he'd like. It's not part of the INEAR network because it's not focused specifically on immigration, but it's a group of foreign policy practitioners who try to make the case for foreign policy based on American national interest specifically. Second speaker is Victor Marshai, who is the director of the Migration Research Institute in Budapest, which is a fellow member of INEAR. And he has actually written and lectures at university on security issues, often and related to immigration. And then finally, Eric Ruark, who's the director of research at the Numbers USA Education Research Foundation, who has written on immigration and spoken about it at some length. So after each of them makes a presentation, we're going to have some Q&A.